The Bodleian is quieter in November, not in the literal sense. Students still murmur over glossaries, rustle paper like dry leaves, and shift restlessly in chairs that will outlive us all. But quieter in the way old places become when the sky forgets to change and the cold presses into the bones of buildings as well as people. I remember the light that afternoon, flat without ceremony, the sort that makes the golden stones seem sallow, the kind of light that doesn't brighten rooms but reveals dust. I wasn't there for work. Not exactly. There are days when the hum of the station and Lewis's careful hovering become too loud in their politeness. Days when I find myself drifting, without plan or malice, into the reading rooms, as if my footsteps were guided by something older than me. A particular sadness, perhaps. Or boredom. I hadn't intended to stop at Duke Humphrey's, but I saw the door ajar and followed the invitation of silence. A selfish thing, I know. There are procedures, sign-in slips, and designated terminals. But the old room has its own way of welcoming trespass. No alarms, no chiding voices, just a sense that it knows why you've come and forgives you for it. The poetry section remains near the alcove, curved and windowless. I brushed a finger along the edge of the second shelf and drew out a volume I hadn't seen since my university days. A collection of minor Latin elegies, thin and foxed. One or two lines surfaced from memory, like the face of a woman one once thought unforgettable. Regret, that universal muse. I was already seated, book half opened, when I noticed it. Not the missing signature, though that came later. No, what first caught me was the smell. Ink. Not musty, archival ink, but sharp, acidic, fresh. I glanced down and saw it, barely dry, on the fly-leaf of a soft-bound notebook tucked within the poetry volume as if hiding in shame. To R.W. in guilt and gratitude, a name I did not recognize. But the ink, yes, that I recognized. Iron gall, if I wasn't mistaken. An old formula, rarely used now, prone to corrosion, the sort of thing that leaves bruises on paper, and it was still wet. I lifted the notebook carefully, avoiding the inscription. Beneath the dedication, there were pages of what looked to be free verse, fragmented lines, enjambments, abrupt endings as though something had intervened mid-thought. A poem about silence, another about footsteps echoing in corridors. One, short and jarring, simply titled Lament for a Lecture Hall. It might have meant nothing. Found objects in libraries are often debris of sentiment, scribbled musings from half-loved affairs, attempts at catharsis, the detritus of youth. And yet, I hesitated. There was a pressure in my chest, not quite anxiety and not quite curiosity. Something colder. That sense, rare but unmistakable, that I had stepped onto the edge of something large and buried. The notebook was unsigned. There was no university crest, no contact slip tucked inside the cover. No borrower's record was attached to the volume. It had been hidden within. I returned both books to the shelf, but not without noting the call number and location. I have never fully trusted memory, especially my own. Outside, the sky had darkened imperceptibly. I crossed the quad without purpose and turned toward Turl Street, where the windows of Brasenose caught a faint gold in their panes like the ghost of summer. I stood watching them for longer than I cared to admit. The ink, I thought, could have been fresh by accident. A pen might have leaked. Someone might have used the wrong volume as a blotter. And yet the words had been placed so deliberately. Not a scrawl, not a name. A dedication. One that felt less like a gift and more like an apology sent too late. At the pub later, I did not speak of it to Lewis. He would have listened. He always does. But it would have felt indulgent, even absurd. A wet fly-leaf in a forgotten poetry book is hardly a case. And yet I remember thinking, as I sipped the first whiskey of the evening, that Oxford is a city best understood by its margins. The things almost said. The regrets are not quite buried. The silence between bells. And that was how it began. Not with a body or a scream or a telephone call in the night, but with a smell of ink and a line in a library that no one meant to read. It was Lewis who told me, of course. He arrived with that look he wears when he's not sure whether the news he brings will interest or irritate me, and he's usually right to worry. Most mornings at the station are filled with the sort of bureaucratic tragedies that rarely ask for thought. Just ink, a stamp, and a resigned nod. But not that morning. Not with the frost still on the hedges outside, not with the peculiar weight I'd carried since the library. "There's been a death, sir. Lonsdale College. Postgraduate student. Katrina Vale." He said the name as though it might mean something to me. It didn't. Not then. A fall, apparently. Or not a fall exactly. No violence, no blood. She was found seated at her desk, head resting on folded arms, as though she'd fallen asleep halfway through some ambitious line of thought. The cleaner, a retired nurse with a sharpened sense of finality, had noticed something wrong in the stillness. Said she knew before she touched the girl's shoulder. Knew by the way the air refused to move. I hadn't intended to go. But something in the way Lewis mentioned the desk, how the papers had been set out neatly, how there had been a bottle of ink spilt but the pen capped, woke the earlier unease in me. I remembered the notebook from Duke Humphreys. I remembered the scent of the ink. And I remembered that half-written line on the flyleaf in Guilt and Gratitude. She'd lived in a set of rooms overlooking the inner garden of Quad E. Lonsdale is one of those small, ancient colleges that wear their history like an uncomfortable suit, always adjusting, never quite at ease. Her rooms had high ceilings, low bookshelves, and one long velvet curtain perpetually drawn. The scent of lavender and iron clung to the air like something preserved out of habit. The paramedics had already gone. The college authorities were hovering, dean, porter, junior bursar. I don't recall their names. They all had that careful blend of shock and formality one learns in places where tradition outranks feeling. They offered condolences as though I'd lost a colleague. Her supervisor was waiting, they said. Dr. Harrow. Literature, of course. Katrina Vale had been working on a thesis that no one could quite name. Intertextual grief, someone offered. Fragmented narratives of self. I heard the phrases but didn't keep them. What I kept was the look on Harrow's face as he stepped into the room. Not grief, not shocked, a kind of unpracticed neutrality. He said she'd been brilliant, quiet, not prone to dramatics. A few poems were published in obscure university reviews. Nothing scandalous. No family close by, mother abroad, father long gone. But the tone of his voice missed something. It missed the fact that people don't die like this without leaving a riddle behind. It was Lewis who noticed the Latin first, a small card pinned above the desk, beneath a postcard of Verona. Fiat voluntas tua, thy will be done. A quote from the Lord's Prayer, certainly, but slightly wrong. The phrasing wasn't liturgical. It was academic, or perhaps theatrical. Either way, it jarred. If she had written it, she'd misquoted something sacred, or done so deliberately. The bottle of ink had indeed spilt, but only across one sheet. A second lay untouched beside it, and on that sheet, a single stanza written in bold hand, each line ending with ellipses, as though hesitation had taken the place of punctuation. I didn't read it aloud. Some things are better deciphered in silence. The porter mentioned no guests the previous night, but he had heard a voice. A man's, perhaps. Late. Said he thought it was the radio. Thought nothing of it until the cleaner came running in. I walked the corridor alone before we left. Cold floors, old wood, a faint sound of pigeons outside. And something else. A scent I couldn't name. Not quite floral, not quite chemical. As though something had been wiped away too quickly. It may have been the same ink, it may have been nothing. But there was something unspoken in that room. Not absence, exactly, but a delay. As though the girl had meant to finish a thought, and someone else had chosen the moment for her. The fellows of Lonsdale received us with the kind of courtesy that requires effort to sustain. That brittle smile, long practiced but rarely sincere, which flickers just below the surface of academic detachment. I've often thought there's something monastic about the inner circles of Oxford. Cloisters of thought protected by ritual, silence, and the occasional well-placed footnote. Lewis, notebook in hand, looked out of place. He always does in these rooms lined with spine-worn volumes and threadbare carpets that have absorbed too many secrets. But I've never minded his unease. It anchors me. They gathered in the senior common room beneath an indifferent portrait of a former chancellor who had once, I was told, quoted Cicero in the face of protest. Tea had been laid out, untouched. A clock ticked too loudly. Dr. Harrow sat with his hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed somewhere near the edge of a window pane. Beside him, Dean Pembroke flicked lint from his sleeve with the air of someone wishing the whole affair were more dignified. There was also a woman, Dr. Clara Dorsey, I think, whose posture held something between resistance and restraint. She offered us coffee that no one drank. Theories were plentiful. Katrina, they said, had become overly immersed in her work. One suggested she'd shown signs of academic burnout. Another referenced the loneliness of postgraduate life. Someone even murmured something about antidepressants, then trailed off into a clearing of the throat. None of it felt honest. I listened. I nodded. I let Lewis take notes that wouldn't help us. But I was watching the table. The fellows each had a cup. None had been sipped from. Harrow's, I noticed, bore a faint rim of lipstick, too faint to be his. Dorsey had no cup at all. Pembroke's was perfectly centered on its saucer, untouched, but the teaspoon beside it had been used to stir. Meaningless, perhaps, but still. I asked whether Katrina had expressed any particular academic concerns, quarrels, missing papers, unusual conversations. Pembroke responded with a tired elegance. She was a gifted student. If there were difficulties, they weren't brought to our attention. Harrow added that she'd been exploring personal themes in her work: fragmentation, displacement, loss of authorial identity. He said it with a kind of sigh, as though these were fashionable illnesses. Dorsey didn't speak until I asked directly. "Did Miss Vale ever speak to you?" "Informally." She hesitated, then said that Catriona had been quiet, a listener, not prone to complaints, but she had once, perhaps a few weeks ago, asked after the archive policies concerning sealed correspondence. Nothing unusual, just curiosity. Sealed correspondence. I asked which archive. "The Pembroke collection," she replied. "Historical letters, old plays, marginalia. Most of it is uncatalogued. Very few have access." I glanced at Harrow. He had blinked at the word plays. It was a small thing, but noticeable. A shift of air, perhaps. Or conscience. Later, as we were leaving, I paused by the staircase that led down to the chapel. There, in the stairwell light, a corkboard displayed the usual notices: upcoming lectures, concert rehearsals, an advert for a room to let, and a photograph. Black and white. A production of some college play, the year unclear. 7 figures in mask and robe. One man kneeling, another blindfolded. The caption read, "The Drowning Muse, Lonsdale College Dramatic Society." I asked Pembroke about it. He said nothing at first. Then, "Oh yes, that old thing. We never performed it. Unfinished script, all very melodramatic." But Harrow had gone very still. I didn't speak of it until later. In the car, Lewis asked if I believed them. "Not yet," I said, "but they're not lying convincingly." There was something in that photograph I couldn't place. A gesture, perhaps. The way one figure, masked, held his hands not like an actor, but like someone praying, or ashamed. Back at the station, I opened my newspaper. A crossword half complete. One clue caught my eye. Vale of Learned Men. 6. I stared at it for a while. The answer was a facade. That night I couldn't sleep. It was the scarf I remembered first. Not the face. Not the voice. Just that streak of red against the stone-grey rain of Radcliffe Square, as sharp and dissonant as a wrong note in a familiar aria. She had worn it with indifference, wrapped once about her throat, the ends trailing behind her like an unfinished sentence. I'd seen it before, somewhere. But memory, especially mine, rarely arrives in the right order. Her name was Moira Ellis. A fellow student, someone said. Literature again. They all are, in some form. Those drawn to the shadows of other people's words, as if truth might be less sharp when filtered through metaphor. Lewis had arranged the interview in the most neutral setting he could manage. The college cafe, low lighting, long windows misted with the cold, the gentle clatter of saucers pretending at comfort. She arrived late, apologized without meaning it, and sat with her hands flat against the table, as if bracing herself against gravity. She looked tired in the eyes, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. She said Katrina hadn't been herself recently, that she'd become more inward, more distracted. But when I asked what that meant, she hesitated. Said that Katrina had begun quoting poems that didn't exist, lines Moira didn't recognize, fragments that didn't rhyme with anything they'd studied. She said it like an accusation. I asked if she had an example. She frowned. Something about silence growing roots, she said. Or was it silence writing itself? I don't know. It was odd. I asked if Katrina had ever spoken of the Pembroke archive. Moira's mouth moved slightly, but no sound came at first. Then, she mentioned a letter once. Something she found, or thought she had found. Said it was going to change how she read everything. I thought she meant her thesis. And did she show you this letter? Number. She said it had disappeared. Or perhaps she'd only dreamed it. That's what she said. That maybe she'd dreamed it. The scarf was still around her throat. I noticed then that it had been mended, very finely, near the hem. A single stitch, darker than the rest, almost hidden. It reminded me of something Lewis once said about wounds. How the neatest scars are always the ones you can't see unless you're looking for them. I asked if Katrina had ever spoken of Dr. Harrow outside of supervision. She blinked. Said that he was brilliant. Brilliant and distant. That he had a way of making you feel as though you were thinking in echoes. And Dean Pembroke? She didn't answer at once. Stirred her tea with a slow circular rhythm. Then he called her Miss Vale, even after she asked him not to. I asked if Katrina had enemies. She smiled, without humor. No, Inspector. Just readers. I liked her. Not in the way that leads to anything, of course. That part of me has long since quietened, but there was an intelligence to her grief, a kind of precision in how she withheld details. She was the sort of person who catalogues pain by date and page number. As we stood to leave, she paused and turned back. There's something you should see. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a photocopy, carefully folded. 6 lines of verse, no title. I read them once, then again. The rhythm was irregular, but the language was striking. Allusions to ink, to betrayal, to silence breaking its seal. One line stood out, where ink uncoils, truth chokes beneath the margin. Where did you get this? She looked away. She found it in her pigeonhole, 2 days before she died. She said she thought it was about her. Or for her. And did you think it was? I don't know, but it frightened her. That night I sat at home with the poem open beside the crossword. The clue read, "Secret written in silence." 4. I stared at it for a long while. The answer, hint, came slowly, like breath returning after a long submersion. I poured a whiskey, but didn't drink it, watched the glass mist slightly in the lamplight, and wondered what sort of poem ends a life. It was the envelope that gave it weight, not the contents. Thin, pale paper, folded without creases, sealed in a way that suggested hesitation. There was no address, only a name in small looping script, M. Searle. The initials rang a bell I could not place at the time. Later, of course, they would toll like a funeral chime. The archivist had been reluctant, though polite. He led me into the narrow back room of the Pembroke collection, all dust motes and stale binding glue. A faint ticking from a high shelf marked time for no one in particular. He said the folder had been found misfiled among anonymous donations, a small trove of ephemera donated by a retired professor's estate some decades ago, uncatalogued, undisturbed, the sort of relics that settle like sediment at the bottom of academic rivers, waiting for a dredger. I told him I was researching literary forgery, which wasn't true but felt near enough to something that was. The envelope had been tucked within a bound folio of drafts for a never-published dramatic verse. On its front, written in the same hand, 3 words, "For destruction only." I broke the seal with the unthinking reverence I reserve for sacred things. Inside, a single page, faintly browned at the edges, the ink thinning where the strokes had pressed too long into the grain. The poem itself is only 10 lines. But something about it unsettled me. It was the 3rd line, not for its words, but their weight. The syntax staggered slightly, as if edited mid-thought. The line read, "She bore his words as chains unlinked." I'd seen it before. In Moira Ellis's photocopy, yes. But there it had read, "She bore his name as chains unlinked." A substitution, small and yet enormous. This poem was older. That much I knew by the ink alone. It had the telltale purple-gray tinge of oxidized iron gall, the kind used in fountain pens before the war. Moira's copy had been printed, clean and recent. Someone had transcribed the original, but not faithfully. Not entirely. I sat there for some time, watching the page. The light from the reading lamp pooled around it like an interrogation. I thought again of Katrina Vale, of the red scarf, of the silence that grows roots. And I thought of the peculiar phrasing in that flyleaf, in guilt and gratitude. It had the same cadence, the same reluctance to confess fully. I copied the poem by hand into my notebook. There are moments when the act of writing helps thought take shape. But this time, it only deepened the fog. The 5th line, "Truth inked in twilight, folded in shame," was followed by an abrupt dash, as if even the writer couldn't finish the thought, or chose not to. Lewis met me outside the college gates. He'd been speaking with the porter again. There was a report now, unofficial, quiet, about a figure seen entering Quadi late on the night of Katrina's death. Tall, male, grey coat, not logged in, not challenged. Lewis said the porter hadn't thought much of it. There's always someone slipping about after hours. I nodded. Told him to ask after faculty keys, how many copies, who had them, who'd misplaced theirs. And then I asked him something else. Find me everything you can on Miriam Searle. Back home, I lay the 2 poems side by side, the original and the altered. I read them aloud, softly, as one might test a lock with a counterfeit key. The altered poem contained 3 words not present in the first. Name, ashes, regret. Each was inserted with surgical precision, and each one is a thread leading away from authorship and toward accusation. That night, my crossword offered a clue that struck me oddly. Poet's betrayal, perhaps hidden in verse? 7. I considered it for a long while before writing the answer. Anagram. It fit, of course, but not just the clue. The day, the case, the girl. Someone had taken a poem and rewritten it to say something else. Not loudly, not crudely, just enough to shift meaning. Just enough to place blame where it wasn't and remove it from where it was. The poem hadn't been meant to be read, but someone had made sure it was. The porter's lodge at Lonsdale sits just off the gatehouse, nestled like a forgotten stanza in a poem too long to memorize. It has that smell all old porters' lodges share. Boiled tea, stale tobacco, wet wool. A comforting scent if you've walked Oxford long enough, and I have. The man himself was named Lubbock. Square in the shoulder, soft in the middle, with a manner that made you think he'd once played rugby and still dreamt of the line-out. But there was something else in him too, something quieter, a patience, perhaps, that comes from watching young people hurry past, without ever being noticed. He remembered Katrina. Everyone said they did, of course, but Lubbock actually did. Said she was one of the few who thanked him by name when parcels came or when the heating went out in the older staircases. Said she always walked like she was late for something, but never seemed flustered. She'd been calm, he said. Always calm. I asked him about the night. He nodded, slowly, as if the memory were a drawer he wasn't quite sure he wanted to open. Said it had been quiet, mostly. Fog had rolled in late, blurring the lamplight and muting the usual nocturnal shuffling. No visitors logged after 9:30, but, and here his eyes narrowed a little, he did think he'd heard voices. Just past midnight. Near the quad, not a row, he said. Nothing loud. Just the sort of murmur you notice when the rest of the world's gone still. A man's voice. Low. Controlled. Not laughing. And a reply. Softer. Uncertain. Could have been her. He wasn't sure. He hadn't gone out to check. The boiler had been playing up and he'd been fiddling with it in the back. Only caught the sound through the vent near the bike racks. By the time he looked out, the quad was empty. I asked if he remembered anything specific. Words, perhaps. A phrase. He frowned. Shifted his weight. Said something about ink. I asked again. He nodded slowly. Don't know why I remember it, but it stuck. Man said something like, "You don't know what ink can do." I felt it like a pulse, low and unwelcome. You don't know what ink can do. I thanked him, told him to let us know if anything else surfaced. He nodded and reached for a mug already stained from previous conversations. Lewis and I walked the quad in silence for a time. The stones were slick with recent rain, and our footsteps echoed in the stillness like punctuation. I stopped near the center and looked up at the windows of Catriona's staircase. One of them had a curtain pulled half across, the edge scalloped like torn paper. Lewis asked if I thought it meant anything. I said everything means something. Eventually. We circled once more. The old sundial near the library had stopped working years ago, but someone had drawn the shadow line in chalk just beneath the gnomon. A childish hand, perhaps, or a poetic one. Ink, I thought again. That smell in her room, the darkness at the edge of her final stanza, the way the flyleaf had glistened in the Bodleian. Ink is memory-made material. It stains and lingers and refuses correction. And yet Lubbock had remembered the phrase as a warning. I found myself scribbling later that night, alone in my flat, with only the scrape of rain on the sash to keep me honest. I wrote it down again. You don't know what ink can do, and beneath it, 3 questions. Who said it? Who was it for? What was being written? The crossword I'd left unfinished greeted me at the table. A clue I'd ignored earlier now tugged at something just below the surface. Dark impression left behind. 5. The answer came without effort. Stain. Not just literal. Not anymore. Outside, somewhere, a bell sounded the hour. I didn't count it. Some truths don't declare themselves. They drift slowly like smoke through the ribs of old timetables. They wait in the overlaps and absences, in the quiet rearrangements no one bothers to explain. That morning, I had no grand revelation. Just a growing itch. The kind that comes from too many things not quite fitting. Lewis had fetched the week's rota from the college porter's log, along with copies of Katrina Vale's official supervision record. There were crossings out in pencil, then overwritten again in ink, Dr. Harrow's neat, slanted hand, adjusting times, shifting appointments forward, canceling others altogether. An entire week of small movements, a polite retreat from visibility. I asked Lewis what he made of it. She was supposed to have met with him twice. Once on Monday, once again on Thursday. Both were cancelled. The second meeting was marked as student unwell. No formal notification, though. Just that phrase. No emails, no letters, no trace of illness anywhere else. I told Lewis to request access to the college's internal mail log, those pale pink slips with carbonless backs that carry gossip in the guise of administration. He nodded. He was learning, always, even in silence. Later that afternoon, I visited the library again. Not the Bodleian this time, but the smaller one at Lonsdale, the sort of space that smells of laminate polish and decaffeinated ambition. The assistant librarian, a dry woman named Sylvia, who wore horn-rimmed glasses on a chain, remembered Katrina, said she'd asked after a particular script, a play, The Drowning Muse, which hadn't been requested in years. She'd collected it herself, despite the request sheet being signed in another name. S. Vale, possibly a sibling or a joke. Possibly not. The play was thin, 26 pages, bound with a black clip, single-spaced and anonymous. It was marked, college use only, unperformed manuscript, 1974. The plot was irrelevant, or at least irrelevant in the way that most collegiate plays are. Moody metaphors posing as character arcs, but a few phrases leapt out. A character named Alethea spoke lines that mirrored those in the altered poem Catriona had received. Not word for word, but close. Close enough to unsettle. Where ink uncoils, the truth recedes into dusk. It hadn't meant anything to me the first time I read it. Now it did. On a hunch, I asked for old records of the College Dramatic Society. Minutes, casting notes, attendance lists. The librarian hesitated, said they weren't technically for public view. I told her I was no longer the public. She brought out a battered red ledger, the spine held together by a loop of twine. Inside, lists of plays proposed, then quietly shelved. Scribbled notes in margins. Comments like tone unsuited for general audience and requires further ethical review. But there it was. The Drowning Muse, proposed by D. Pembroke and R. Harrow, performed only in private rehearsal. Never staged. I closed the ledger and thanked her. She didn't ask why I was interested. Outside, the rain had begun again, one of those Oxford drizzles that can't be seen but seeps in all the same. Back at the station, I laid everything out. Supervision notes, archive records, the borrowed manuscript. I didn't need to cross-reference them. The pattern was clear. Catriona had started following a trail, a quiet one, buried in old lines and buried friendships. Someone had known. Someone had shifted timetables not because of illness, but because of risk. I looked at the crossword on my desk, a clue I hadn't solved yet tugged at me now. Rehearsal of old truth, buried twice, 7. I stared at it for what felt like a long time, then wrote the word revival, a return, a repetition, a risk. I thought again of Katrina, bent over a desk, red scarf unwinding, pen hesitating above the page. There are some truths that wait patiently, and others that cannot be summoned without cost. There are days when everything moves in silence, not a welcome silence like the hush of a library or the stillness before an overture, but the brittle kind, the kind that feels as if the world has held its breath too long and might forget how to exhale. That morning, I awoke before the alarm. The light coming through the curtains had that grey, undifferentiated quality that makes you question whether it's dawn or dusk, or whether it matters. I reached for the paper out of habit, but not expectation. The Times had grown lazy in its cryptics, favouring cleverness over depth. Still, it kept my hands occupied while the kettle sulked its way toward boiling. The clue was near the centre of the grid. 6 letters. Old sins cast long shadows. 6. I paused. I knew the answer. Of course I did. Guilt. It sat too neatly on the page, as if waiting. By the time Lewis arrived, I'd already circled the clue twice in ink, though I hadn't filled it in. He brought news I hadn't asked for, but somehow expected. Someone had returned to Katrina's room, a student apparently. A first year who'd been sent to collect something for the porter, forgotten belongings or perhaps just a misplaced task. No one noticed at first, but the door had been left ajar, and the supervision lock, a flimsy pink carbon pad, was no longer on the desk where we'd seen it. Now it sat beneath a half-drunk mug of tea and a day-old copy of the Oxford Student. The arrangement was too deliberate. Someone had been back, someone who knew precisely what to touch and what to leave. Lewis said there was no sign of forced entry. But then, there rarely is in Oxford. Everyone has keys or thinks they should. The locks are more ceremonial than secure. The crossword on the desk was from last Friday. It hadn't been there before. Katrina had filled in exactly 3 clues, each in the same steady, elegant hand, but one stood out. 7 down, unsaid, unread, understood, 5. She'd written quietly. Not silence, not hush. Quiet, as though the absence of noise had been a condition, not a setting. I read the other 2 answers. Stain and veil. Someone had chosen those words. Chosen them for her, or through her. I sat at her desk, ignoring Lewis's quiet hovering, and stared at the paper. The grid was almost empty, but the center, those 3 words, they were deliberate. Quiet. Stain veil. A pattern or a message. Or perhaps just the final thoughts of someone trying to translate pain into a puzzle. Later, walking the quad, I stopped beneath a window where the ivy had grown ragged, its leaves curling like pages left too near the fire. I don't know why I looked up. Perhaps I thought I might see her there, watching. Or perhaps I was waiting for something else. An echo. Lubbock had left early. A different porter was on duty now, younger, more forgettable. He said nothing had changed. They never do. But I remembered something Lubbock had said. About the voice, about the phrase. You don't know what ink can do. It was poetic. Too poetic. Not something said in anger or panic. Something rehearsed. A line, perhaps. A line from a play. Or a poem. Or both. Back at the station, I opened my notebook, turned to the transcription from the Pembroke archive. Truth inked in twilight, folded in shame. I'd missed it before, perhaps because I didn't want to see it. The phrase inked in twilight mirrored something in Harrow's lecture from last term, one I'd stumbled across in an old prospectus, writing at the edge of dusk, where narrative phrase into confession. He had used the same phrasing, they always do, eventually. The clue from this morning hovered again in my mind. Old sins cast long shadows. I wrote it out once more, underlined the answer. Guilt, a word that never arrives loudly, just settles and stays. It was Lewis who found her, or rather, found where she had gone. A line in an alumni ledger, half smudged by rain or memory, had marked her departure in 1976. Miriam Searle. Once a lecturer in comparative literature, now retired, or vanished, to a coastal village in Dorset. No forwarding address, but a cottage name. Sea-writ. The train ride was slow, the kind that invites too much thinking. Fields passed like unfinished thoughts, pale and sodden, and I watched them without seeing. I'd brought nothing with me but the poem, the original one. Folded so many times, its creases had become veins. I hadn't told Lewis I was going. Some conversations sound ridiculous even before they're spoken. Sea-writ was set back from the road, behind a gate so rusted it whispered rather than clicked. The garden had grown wild in a way that didn't feel accidental. Ivy clung to the brickwork like old secrets. There was no bell, only a knocker shaped like a swallow. She opened the door before I touched it, as though she'd been waiting, or simply knew that people only ever came here when something hurt. She hadn't aged so much as thinned, the kind of thinning that happens when someone gradually unhooks themselves from the world. Her hair had gone the color of driftwood. Her eyes, still sharp, were unreadable. She didn't ask who I was, just stepped aside. The sitting room smelled of sea salt and typewriter ink. There were no photographs, only books, stacked, shelved, sprawled across the floor like exhausted children. I noticed an old edition of Horace propping up a crooked table leg. She poured tea without asking and said only one thing before the silence settled. "So, it's come back." I placed the poem on the table. She didn't touch it, just stared at it as if waiting for the ink to rearrange itself. "I wrote that for no one," she said finally. "Not even for myself." Her voice was gentle but not soft. The voice of someone who had once spoken in lecture halls and had long since stopped needing to be believed. She said the poem had been a confession, of a kind, that in 1974, a student, bright, troubled, in love with the wrong kind of brilliance, had taken her own life, that the college had said the right things. Tragic, promising, sensitive, that none of them had said why. She didn't say the name. She didn't need to. The student had been involved with a married man, a man older, revered, careless in the way that academics can be when they believe intellect excuses everything. There had been no accusation, only a silence that deepened and a term cut short. Then the news. I asked why she had written the poem. "To hold the guilt somewhere," she said. "Somewhere outside my body. And why seal it? Because I thought he might need it more than I did. I gave it to him. Harrow, I didn't speak. I didn't need to." She stood and moved to the window. Outside, the sea blurred into the sky, the distinction lost somewhere along the horizon. "He said the ink was dry," she said, almost to herself. But I never believed him. She turned back. I asked if she had ever spoken to Katrina Vale. Number. Only of her. I nodded, then asked, "Why now?" Her answer was quiet. "Because someone wants a reckoning, and someone else wants to bury it again." I stayed a moment longer, watching the light bend against the bookshelf. She said nothing else, and I left without asking her to. On the train back, I unfolded the poem again, stared at the final line. Some silences are written louder than speech. I glanced down at the crossword I'd stuffed in my coat pocket. A clue I hadn't solved yet came back to me now. Hidden voice, echoing after departure. 6. I wrote it in the margin. Resign. It sat there, gently accusing. The path to truth is rarely a straight line. More often it's a palimpsest, overwritten and half erased, truth bleeding through where someone forgot to press hard enough with the lie. That day, I found myself thinking not of the case, though it still clung to me like damp wool, but of hands. The ones that write, the ones that touch paper and mean to leave no trace but do so anyway. Lewis had called ahead. The final forensic report had come through. Not dramatic, not conclusive. But it had said enough, in the way only small details can. The ink on Catriona's fingers wasn't modern, not water-based, not commercial. It had the chemical trace of iron gall, the same formula used for centuries and now kept mostly by archivists, enthusiasts, or those with a fondness for antiquity. The kind that stains deep, eats slowly through the fibers of paper and skin. It wasn't the sort she would have had. Not from the campus shop. Not from any undergraduate's desk. But someone had. She hadn't used it recently. The stains, they said, were thin, likely absorbed through touch rather than from writing. No smears, no pooled marks on her palms. Just a faint crescent on her left index finger, like a comma trying to disappear into the silence of her skin. She'd handled something then, something old, or made to appear old. Back in her room, I stood in front of the desk again. The curtain had been drawn since my last visit. The dust had begun to settle. Her tea mug remained, a faint ring blooming on the coaster. I touched nothing, just watched. The pages she had written, those left behind, were not remarkable in themselves. Half poems, lists of reference texts, a sentence begun and never finished. The page watches the writer as much as and then nothing. But the new clue wasn't on the page. It was in what wasn't. There was no blotting paper, no fountain pen, only the ink bottle, antique, square-sided. The label was removed, cap crusted, and when I held it, Gloved, careful, I saw that the inside edge of the rim bore the faint sheen of use. Recent use, but not hers. She had touched it, yes, but she hadn't poured from it. The ink hadn't been hers to use, it had been left for her, staged, deliberately. I thought of the line from the altered poem, where ink uncoils, truth chokes beneath the margin, and the earlier phrase, spoken in shadow, overheard by the porter, "You don't know what ink can do." They weren't metaphors anymore, they were instructions. Someone had inked a message using an old formula to suggest age, to suggest rediscovery, to suggest history's hand rather than a modern one. The ink had been a trick, a sleight of hand, like painting a fake crack in a vase and calling it antique. She had found the page, or been shown it, had touched it, had seen herself written into it, and believed it. The tragedy wasn't in the forgery, but in the faith. Lewis arrived, breath fogging in the corridor light. He said they'd checked again. No fingerprint on the ink bottle cap. Wiped clean, but the base had one partial, old, degraded, but angled strangely, as if someone had held it while turning it slowly. Left hand. Most people are right-handed. She had been. I asked him to bring me Harrow's lecture notes, those archived by the department, and also the signed copies of any references he'd written for students in the past year. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I'd seen enough people disguise handwriting to know it never works completely. Line weight betrays more than language ever does. He nodded, said he'd have them by morning. I stayed a while longer. On the wall above her desk, a single thumbtack held nothing now, just a pale square where something had once been pinned. The misquoted Latin had been removed, or had it fallen? I bent close, and on the plaster there was a faint line. Faded ink, transferred by damp or time. She had touched it, I thought again. Not with reverence, not with certainty. Just enough to leave a mark. That night the crossword offered me a closing whisper. Faint proof, barely seen, 6. I didn't hesitate. Trace. There is a kind of stillness to evensong at Lonsdale College that makes one forget the century. The air inside the chapel is never quite warm, as if the building has made peace with a slower form of decay. Pews whisper when leaned upon, and the brass candlesticks glint not brightly, but apologetically, like old men who remember better times and wish you hadn't asked. I hadn't meant to attend the service, but I'd seen Harrow's name in the newsletter. He was reading the first lesson. I'd always thought there was a quiet cruelty to that tradition, summoning those whose faith is most ambiguous to speak sacred words aloud. The chapel was sparsely filled. A few students in gowns too long for them, a don or two whose eyes stayed fixed on the stained glass, as if hoping to be forgiven by color alone. I sat at the rear, coat damp from the rain, the familiar weight of guilt and distance settling into my shoulders like dust. Harrow's voice was lower than I remembered. He read from Ecclesiastes. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. A line that fits almost too easily in Oxford. It passed through the air like a forgotten promise. I watched him as he spoke. No tremor, no stammer. But when he sat down, he didn't quite meet anyone's eye. That, I've found, is more telling than tears. Afterwards, I waited in the cloister. The stone was slick, and the evening air had that bruised hue that means the rain hasn't finished yet. Harrow emerged slowly, alone, hands folded behind his back as if still delivering a sermon to no one in particular. He didn't start when I stepped out of the shadows. Just nodded, as though he'd known. I said nothing at first, let the quiet fill its shape. He spoke before I did. It wasn't meant to happen like this. I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. Not directly. Just looked toward the quad, where the bell tower rose above the gables like an unspoken line in a poem too painful to finish. She was too clever, he said finally. Too clever and too hopeful. She thought the poem was a discovery. She didn't realize it was a warning. I watched his face. The way the words were formed was too carefully, like someone assembling an apology from parts that didn't quite fit. I asked if he had written the alterations. He nodded, barely. Said he had copied the original by hand, added a line or two. To nudge the meaning, to shape the past. Said he didn't think she'd take it to heart, only that it might redirect her. Remind her that stories are dangerous when incomplete. I asked if he had given it to her directly. He hesitated, then said no. He'd left it in the archive reading room. Marked. Open. Let chance do the rest. And then I asked about Pembroke. He looked away. He knew. Of course he knew. He always knows. There was a silence then, long enough to be mistaken for absolution. The college bell tolled 6, once, then again. Harrow flinched, but just slightly, a man out of rhythm with time. He turned to leave. Paused. "You don't know what ink can do," he said quietly. Then he walked into the dark. I didn't stop him. Not that night. There are some confessions that aren't made for the police. Only for ghosts. Back in my flat, I poured whiskey without tasting it. The crossword lay unfinished on the side table, a single blank square in the lower corner. Line that echoes too long. 5. I stared at it, unsure. Then wrote, "Chime." It didn't feel right, but it didn't feel wrong either. Outside, the bell at Lonsdale tolled again. A final mark on the evening. And somewhere in the silence that followed, I began to understand that what had happened wasn't about love, or cruelty, or ambition. It was about the stories we inherit, and the ink we use to rewrite them.